Content warning. This story contains descriptions of violence, corporal punishment, and the realities of slavery. Inside the mind of the enslaved woman who spent 3 years poisoning her mistress begins with a cup of tea. Steam rose in a thin, pale ribbon from a porcelain lip, fogging the veranda just enough to blur the plantation beyond. The tray was silver. Its surface caught the late afternoon light and handed it back clean and small. A spoon tapped the rim of the cup, an unremarkable sound, a domestic punctuation. To the household it was a ritual. 4:15, the mistress's tea. To the women in the kitchen it was schedule and surveillance, a moment when power walked through the house in measurable steps, footsteps, laughter, a glance that could erase a life. This is not an invented tableau. It is the recovered account of Benedita, an enslaved cook at Fazenda das Flores in the 1860s, according to oral histories preserved by descendants and local chroniclers. The dates recorded in those retellings cluster around 1863 to 1866. The player of authority was Dona Isabel Ferreira de Andrade, a woman whose taste for discipline and control hardened into cruelty. The one who watched, measured, and ultimately acted was Benedita, and the wound that fixed her resolve was the public whipping of her daughter, Maria. Fazenda das Flores lay in the country that fed a global hunger for coffee. Its Casa Grande was a small palace of painted wood and wide eaves, with a pair of columns on the porch, as if to say permanence. Inside, upholstery and fine china were the visible work of other people's labor. Outside, the senzala, rows of crude buildings where the enslaved slept, made the cost plain at night. Wealth here was sewn into the seams of every domestic gesture. The way a table was set, the way a broom moved through a corridor, the way a woman's face could be ordered to smile for guests while her back was ripped away in the yard. Benedita was known in the house for the certainty of her hands. She could fold a napkin into a fan, pour coffee that settled into the cup as if it had always meant to be there, and carry a silver tray without a single tremor. She had a small, sharp laugh that belonged to the kitchen and to those who survived there. Her daughter, Maria, was a bright, quick girl whose beauty, according to those who told the story, earned attention that was never kind. Beautiful girls were dangerous, some housewives would say in the low, knowing way of the powerful. For Dona Isabel, Maria's beauty was an offense, proof that grace could exist without permission. Coronel Antonio Ferreira, the plantation owner, came and went with the business of land that produced money from other people's bodies. He delegated order and punishment to overseers and to a mistress who found in discipline a private joy. That joy showed itself plainly one Sunday morning, in a yard filled with other enslaved people, in a spectacle of pain meant to teach obedience. They say the whipping took place after the mistress claimed a stolen piece of clothing, an accusation that needed no legal proof. The instruments and rules of punishment were not for trial but for theater. A rope, a post, a public stage where the masters demonstrated the cost of crossing invisible lines. Maria was brought out, hands bound. The whip, when it came down, had a sound like a bell being rung in anger, quick, final, a punctuation of authority. Each crack scattered voices, some small, some tearing from the crowd. Benedita was not at the post. She watched from the kitchen window from a place of hired invisibility. The sight of her daughter's bare back, the skin broken and weeping, settled into her like a slow frost. The whipping did more than bruise flesh. It severed a margin of possibility. Maria survived. She bore scars that would not fade. But the known legal and social channels of recourse were closed to Benedita. She could run. It would condemn them both to another set of harms. She could appeal to Coronel Antonio or to the local authorities, the men who profited from the plantation's order, but such appeals were paper thrown into wind. The law, where it served, often served property rather than person. Benedita's options had shrunk to what could be done within the seam of the house itself, within the contours of what she could touch. That narrowing is what the narrative asks us to hold as we look into her mind. It is tempting to imagine a sudden monster born of pain, a woman who turns instantaneous, needful, and headline-caliber violent. The truth, as the oral account preserves it, is quieter and colder. Benedita did not explode. She planned. She watched. For 3 months she mapped the mistress's habits as a merchant, the daily receipts of a shop. She noted the tea, always at 4:15, in porcelain, lightly sweetened, served on a silver tray by a servant whose face was not supposed to be read. The ritual itself made a window, the same way the repeated opening of a door eventually blurs into a way to get unseen. What went through Benedita's head in those weeks is partly given and partly indefinido. There is no record of a manifesto or an explicit declaration. What survives is behavior. She moved within the house with the care of someone rehearsing patience. She collected things that were small and unremarkable, leaves folded into cloth, powders that could be mixed into sugar, and she hid them not in dramatic caches, but in places that mimicked the domestic clutter. A jar under the sink, a tin with other tins, a pocket in an apron. Community memory insists that certain plant names appeared in the margins of the story. The names mean nothing as recipes here and are mentioned only as glimpses into the botanical knowledge that enslaved people often carried. But the telling always holds a line. This was not an act of improvisation. It was methodical. The method had a moral architecture. Benedita understood the ethics of anonymity. To make Donna Isabel's death appear as the work of nature, disease, decay, a private falling away, meant that the household would not suspect foul play. Suspicion would invite inquiry, and inquiry would force the truth into a world unwilling to see the daily violence that produced it. So she learned to let time be her accomplice. Poison, in the moral language of the era and our own, is treacherous because it suffocates the narrative. It kills the moment of violence in favor of a long erasure. The choice to make suffering drag was a perverse mimicry of the plantation's own tactics. The master's slow violence, the legal and economic and emotional attrition of slavery, became the instrument of revenge. There is a small cruelty to this. The mistress's pain would be long and baffling, and the family and physician would patrol that bafflement with credulity. The social imagination of the household was primed to attribute weakness to natural causes or to temperament. Women in authority could be read as fragile creatures whose bodies failed them. A male doctor, called into the house, might never pronounce suspicion. The house's privilege daily blinded its members to the mechanics of slow harm. Benedita's interior discipline was not only about guesswork. It demanded a performance of normalcy that would bend the household into complacency. She polished the tray until it shone. She wrapped the teapot in a cloth as if protecting it from dust. She adjusted cushions and smoothed napkins. She let her hands show their usual competence, while her mind measured each movement in time increments. The second it took the mistress to lift the cup, the pause after the first sip, the way she sometimes dabbed her mouth with a handkerchief. These observations were data, folded into a patient's rhythm. 3 months of observation hardened into action, and action then folded into a rituality even darker than the mistress's tea. Benedita began to insert small, indistinct amounts into the sugar. The powder vanished into granules. Once dissolved, it left nothing for the untutored eye. The first time the mistress coughed, a thin, suspicious sound that she waved away as a passing discomfort. Benedita saw it and felt a vertigo. No triumph, only the immediate focusing dread of whether this would unmake everything. She learned to wait. Waiting taught her the cruel mathematics of the plan. Accelerate too fast, and you provoke a doctor's curiosity. Pace it too slow, and you may not achieve the retribution you had measured. At the edge of the kitchen, the other enslaved women noticed shifts in the household, but did not know the cause. They watched Donna Isabel grow paler, saw her appetite falter, heard her speak of wandering pain, and they whispered without vocabulary for what was happening. Rumors spread in the way they always had, softly, with many alterations. Some said the mistress had sinned against God and was being punished. Others said she was reaping what she had sown in the world. The plausibility of natural causes was enough for most who were not required to investigate. Doctors visited. Their visits mattered less than their assumptions. In the medical culture of the mid-19th century, a list of reported symptoms could be mistaken for a dozen illnesses. Bloodletting remained a legitimate practice in many circles. A physician's hand, steady and institutional, could make more harm than the hidden powder, and there is evidence in the accounts that treatments sometimes exacerbated the mistress's decline. The household was content to accept official diagnosis. To acknowledge foul play would be to acknowledge a failure of the social order, and such admissions were rare among those who profited most from that order. It is worth pausing on the shape of Benedita's mind, not to justify, but to understand. She was not a caricature of vengeance. She was a mother whose primary calculus was the safety of her child. Maria's scars were both a map and a compass. Love in conditions of bondage educated people into forms of action that free people rarely understand. Choices that demand secrecy, patience, and the acceptance of ambiguous moral status. Benedita's tactics fit into a broader set of acts of resistance: slight, visible rebellions, covert sabotage, the theft of food, the whispering of songs that contained messages of direction. But there is a difference between petty theft and premeditated harm. The oral record never reduces Benedita to a simple category. The people who tell the story remember a woman who had learned the laws of the house, who had used that knowledge against the house itself. On the veranda that summer, beneath a sun that had no stake in either side of this conflict, the mistress continued her tea. Guests came and left, unaware of the narrow wars waged in porcelain bowls. Inside the kitchen, Benedita moved like shadow and habit, appearing just when needed, receding when observed. Watching her was a kind of discipline. She kept an exactness of absence, not too eager to serve, not too remote, the perfect invisible servant. When the first waves of illness announced themselves in the mistress, they did so quietly. There were bouts of nausea, of dizziness, some jaundice in the eyes. The mistress complained less of pain than of fatigue. She cancelled a scheduled visit to neighboring landowners, then another. The household exchanged notes in softened voices. Some cried out for the sanctity of a priest, others for the expertise of the doctor. Benedita cultivated a face of concern she did not always feel.
Her interior life was occupied now by a new set of calculations. How to maintain the pace, how to keep the observation long enough, how to ensure that suspicion remained distracted by plausible natural failure.
At night, when the house slept, Benedita listened to the creak of floorboards and the hush of breathing. The plan required her to avoid the absolutes of passion. She had to keep a coldness, a measured restraint. It is hard to imagine patience as a weapon, but for Benedita, it became exactly that. She became the keeper of intervals, days counted by the rhythms of the mistress's sips, weeks measured by the change of color in a face. To be patient was to be effective, and efficacy in that world meant staying out of sight of the law and in sight only of those who could not or would not press. The household changed in small, telltale ways. Guests began to leave earlier. The donkey that carried produce to market was loaded differently. The mistress's laughter grew thin. Even the dogs, animals attuned to human shifts, were quieter. Outside, the fields kept their business. Slavery's economy had a long inertia. A single life falling or weakening inside a house rarely altered the work in the fields. Crop schedules did not wait for moral reckonings. That inertia was exactly the sort of structural advantage that allowed the plan to unfold. The plantation's motion smoothed over blips, and the social world around the house moved on, uninterested in why one woman slept more or drank less. In the kitchen, the enslaved women absorbed the risk in degrees. Some sensed that Benedita had changed, but did not know how to place the change. Others saw only the surface. Maria more withdrawn, Benedita more watchful. There were moments of near exposure, an accidental drop of a spoon, an unexpected guest arriving earlier than scheduled, each handled with the nimbleness honed by years of managing crises. The risk was constant. Benedita would not be the first person to be caught, and the consequences of such a discovery were stark: violence, sale of family members, or worse. She understood that every action carried the possibility of reverberation. An episode that circulated in the oral account illustrates the house's ordinary blindness. A visiting woman, a cousin of the mistress, remarked in passing about the mistress's waning skin. "She looks paler," she said at supper, touching the rim of her teacup. "Ah, the poor thing," someone replied, and the conversation slid into recipes for broths and tonics. The idea that someone would use sickness as an instrument of revenge was so alien to their moral universe that it did not occur to them as a serious possibility. Suspicion required a leap the household could not be bothered to take. This is a crucial point of the story's psychology. Power breeds assumptions that protect the power holder. Those assumptions become a kind of institutional ignorance. For Benedita, who daily navigated those assumptions, invisibility became a resource. She folded into the role that made her unseen, to others, a servant, to herself, a strategist. The moral paradox is sharp. To employ invisibility to act on a visible wrong demands a kind of ethical contortion. You must become what they believe you are to escape their scrutiny. It is easy, from a distance, to ask whether there were other paths. That is part of the moral labor the story insists upon. Were there legal options? Not meaningful ones. Were there alternatives less violent? Possibly. But the structural limitations of the time, the absence of protective rights, the complicity of law, the normalization of punishment, made such alternatives either illusory or as harmful in other ways. This is not to excuse what Benedita did. It is to account for a human mind operating under constraints so tight that ordinary moral calculus is forced into unfamiliar shapes. As months turned into seasons, Benedita's plan matured. The mistress's symptoms clustered into patterns that alarmed even the most complacent observers. At dinner, her hand sometimes trembled on a glass. She lost weight. Her face hollowed. Physicians were summoned more frequently. The official records from the house, if any were kept, would read like many other private ledgers. Bills paid, a name scratched at the bottom of a note, an acknowledgement that a woman was sick. No one thought to ask whether sickness could be engineered, and yet life in the house went on in its banal cruelty. The mistress, when lucid, maintained the same order, a reprimand here, a demand there. The whip's symbolism persisted even when the whip itself was not present. In the kitchen, debts were paid in silence. Benedita maintained the cadence of her work, and in doing so made the plan bureaucratic, something that could be scheduled, audited, repeated. If revenge is often imagined as a climactic, dramatic blow, Benedita's revenge was instead the bureaucratization of harm, the reduction of a moral act to an administrative task. That is what makes it both chilling and legible. There were moments when Benedita's resolve wavered. The telling of her story preserves a few such edges. Nights when she sat alone and cried until the plates in the cupboard echoed her sobs. Mornings when Maria's hand slipped into hers and the child's small scarred back made Benedita's fingers ache. These details, preserved in family memory, complicate the image of a bloodless strategist. She was a mother whose blood ran the same as any other mother's. Pain and calculation coexisted. When she paused, the pause was not a failure, but the human cost of a plan that required her own disconnection from immediate compassion. As the second year unfurled, the household became a theater of slow decline. The mistress complained of nausea and abdominal pain in the most general terms. The physician's notes, if anyone outside the family ever saw them, would list ambiguous diagnoses: chronic malaise, unknown congestion, infection. Bloodletting occurred during one visit, a practice that might have been more fashionable than beneficial. Those who had been meant to heal sometimes made the condition worse, their treatments sympathetic to the assumptions of their time. No inquiry followed the treatments. The death that would finally come, when it came, would be certified in the language of the physician, perhaps infection or complication. That certificate would be a legal record that codified ignorance. To an outside observer reading the file, the mistress's death would be a sad, private conclusion. To those who knew, it would be dissonant to find comfort in a form stamped by the state's authority. The house's instruments of order, doctors, priests, legal forms, had been enlisted in the service of blindness. What did Benedita think about all this as the years tightened? She had learned to compartmentalize. Her mind held a ledger of small successes and setbacks. She counted by cups served and by the mistress's changing gait. She rationed her emotions so that the act of serving tea, so simple, so ordinary, became the center of her life. To the watcher on the porch, nothing special happened. To her, each serving was laden with consequence. She lived in a state of continuous moral computation, where every emotion was checked against the outcome she sought. The voices of the enslaved community around her spoke in a mixture of sympathy and practical caution. Some urged caution. Do not be seen, they advised. Others murmured more dangerous sympathies. Let her have what she deserves. Those sayings are preserved in oral registers that carry the hesitation of memory. The community was not monolithic. It held people who thought that private revenge would prolong a cycle of violence, and those who thought the master's own violence deserved an answer that would not wait for law. That debate is part of the texture of the tale, a reminder that resistance took many forms, and that moral clarity was rarely easy in a world built on systematic harm. At a certain point, an outward sign appeared that made ordinary human conversation around the house change tone. The mistress fainted during dinner one evening, a slender collapse that sent a wineglass rolling. The suddenness of that fall commanded attention. People rushed, and for the first time, the household displayed a small panic. Benedita moved among them as a presence who could assuage physical need. She fanned, she fetched broths, she smoothed a pillow. Her hands were the hands that had been there since Maria had been a child. In that moment she seemed to serve two masters, one in duty, one in secret retribution. The house's privileged public began to consider the possibility of a deeper illness. Yet even as they contemplated severity, they still could not imagine poison. The category of intentional harm did not sit easily in their minds. It belonged in their logic to a world of thieves and outsiders, not to the intimate circuits of their home. For them, the idea that an enslaved woman would use the household's rhythms to orchestrate suffering was outside cognition. Benedita watched the doctor scribble words she could neither read nor fully trust. She watched the mistress rest, and in those rests she saw her victory and her cost. She had, in the small arithmetic of the household, created a sustained illness. The longer the mistress suffered, the more the family's patience eroded, and the more their reliance on professional authority increased. That reliance, in turn, buried the question of intentionality beneath a heap of diagnoses and treatments. It was a system that protected itself. And so the plan continued, quiet and relentless. Benedita kept the schedule. The tea remained, as if nothing had shifted, as if afternoon light had no taste for the moral calculations now poured into porcelain. Outside the house, the plantation continued its inventory of leaves and beans. The enslaved people went to work in the fields with the steady rhythm of those who must plant and harvest to survive. The world had not altered course. It merely continued while Benedita's quiet revolution advanced one measured sip at a time. By the end of the second year, the mistress's condition had attracted visiting relatives and a stream of gossip. Advisors offered cures that were half religious and half medical. Benedita performed her tasks with an efficiency that bordered on indifference. She did what she had to do, and then retreated into small corners of the house where she could let grief come in like a tide. She spoke sometimes with Maria in halting sentences. They did not rehearse the past. They only acknowledged scars and the fact of survival. Maria learned to keep her eyes low in public. In private, she would touch her back and see the pattern of ruling hands still mapped there. It is here, nearly 2 years into the campaign, that the psychological tension in the house swelled. Benedita had become the keeper of two contradictory truths. She was simultaneously the maker of a slow, hidden violence and the defender of a child whose life had been almost taken by the visible cruelty of another. To hold both truths is to shape a mind with rare, sustained complexity. She neither reveled in malevolence nor surrendered entirely to mercy. She occupied an ambiguous moral interior that the language of heroes and villains cannot cleanly hold. The household's reaction was predictable in its form and unpredictable in its tone. They called in curious physicians with different theories: worms, bile imbalances, the effects of climate. Each diagnosis carried with it an authority that, once issued, dampened curiosity. The plantation's social circuits preferred the comfort of professional language to the unsettling possibility that an internal sabotage had occurred. The formality of a doctor's certificate could be a cleaner end than the murky alternative of criminal investigation. As a third year began, a new rhythm settled over the house. Benedita's movements smoothed into the schedule she had designed. Each cup became less a step toward a goal, and more a step that had always been there. The moral cost of her action did not lessen, but the cognitive load of secrecy eased into habit. Habit, in this context, is a kind of moral anesthetic. It makes choices routine and dulls the immediate sensation of transgression. For Benedita, to be habitual at harm was a painful mastery. During those months, neighboring estates started to notice changes. Stories drifted through rural networks. Donna Isabel is ill, some said over fences. Others, pausing to emphasize their own moral distance, said, "It must be climate." The rumor did not take the shape of an accusation. It took the shape of a whispered pity that cleansed the speaker of involvement. The plantation world had an internal economy of rumor that often functioned like a sieve. It allowed in what conformed to expectations and shed what would force a reckoning. Inside the house, small precautions began to appear. The sugar box, once left open as an ordinary convenience, was locked at times, then left open again. Servants tasted food for the mistress before bringing it out, sometimes with shrugs that implied the taste made no difference. These reactions suggest an awareness at the edges, nervous acts that did not yet become formal suspicion. Benedita watched these gestures and understood their implications. Any real vigilance could expose her. She learned to mimic complacency even when fear flagged under her skin. The narrative of what happens next is where memory begins to thin and where the official record grows faint. There are mentions, preserved in family oral histories, of a long, ugly decline that ended in a death certificate using the language of medicine. There are also notes of fear in the immediate aftermath, and of Benedita's continued anonymity within the house, even as everything else changed around her. But at the point where the decline became public, where a doctor finally pronounced a terminal condition, there remained a space in which the household consensus cocooned itself against the idea of foul play. It is a moment that throws into relief the question at the heart of any story of revenge carried out in the shadows. What does it mean to act decisively when the visible institutions of justice and mercy are closed? The question does not admit easy answers. It asks us instead to sit with discomfort, to hold in one thought both the atrocity that produced Benedita's vow and the atrocity she enacted, each inextricable from the other. The plantation's architecture made both possible. It also made confession and reconciliation unlikely. And so Benedita continued. She carried her tray. She polished the silver. She brewed the tea that had become a slow mechanism of retribution. Outside, the coffee trees kept their seasons. Inside, a woman who had been broken in public by another's cruelty measured her days by cups and teaspoons. At a certain afternoon, an ordinary one, the mistress paused mid-sip, and the house hushed in that peculiar way that precedes an event that will be stitched afterwards into a narrative. People inclined toward superstition called for prayers, those with more medical training called for support. In the kitchen, Benedita watched the moment she had engineered approach its own accidental finality. She knew the timeline she had set. She felt neither triumph nor the relief she had once imagined. Instead, there was a quiet dread, as if something in her were being tested, not by the act, but by the consequences that would immediately otherwise pour out into a world that had no rules for it. That hush, pregnant with possible revelation, was where the first part of this story stops, the moment when the household constricts and the future presses in. The question that sits like a weight in the air is not merely whether the mistress will die. It is whether the house will finally, in the face of a bodily collapse, look inward and see the violence that made the kitchen a place both of survival and of retribution. The next steps, how neighbors, physicians, and family respond, whether the law is invoked, how Benedita's own conscience endures, remain to be told from the careful fragments preserved in oral memory and local records. For now, Benedita stands at the center of her own reckoning, the silver tray warm in her hands, the tea steam rising like the small, indifferent smoke of a world that keeps turning while human lives are weighed and measured inside it. The cup trembled in her hand, a tiny vessel that had for 3 years been recast as a slow instrument. The mistress's breath hitched, the household held as if listening for a verdict. A hand went to a throat, fingers fumbling at cloth. Someone shouted for water. Benedita watched, as she had watched so many times before, but the watching now pressed against a different edge. This time the watching might be answered by a visible end. Donna Isabel's face lost the last of its masks. She sank back in the chair. The clatter in the room became larger than the sound of a fallen cup. Voices rose in that thinning register people use when they do not yet understand what they mourn. A servant lifted a curtain and called for the doctor. Benedita moved while others moved, hands steady in the only way she now knew how, as if to soothe, to make practical the sudden chaos. Her palms were cool. Her heart beat a precise, indifferent rhythm that belonged to habit more than to feeling. Physicians arrived, summoned by carriage and by worry. They examined and pronounced in the language of their training. The words infection and complication, phrases that do the work of closing conversation, were written into a small book and folded into the formal ledger of the house. The legal paper that would follow contained the sort of tidy phrase a bureaucracy trusts: a death certified by medical authority, a life circumscribed by a line that begins with a name and ends with a date. For those who asked, the official record supplied a conclusion. For others, the silence around motive was itself an explanation. No one in the household asked, loudly enough, a question their assumptions could not bear. Could a servant who polished silver and polished stories of loyalty also be the instrument of a calculated domestic death? The thought did not fit easily into the logic of property and trust. Masters and mistress had always imagined their intimate world as sealed from the kinds of intrusions that would suggest culpability in the familiar. The very intimacy they prized, people who knew their habits, touched their linens, prepared their cups, was recoded by that assumption as safety. The funeral was as the house knew how to make funerals, formal, scented, a performance of grief in which the city's important people were given places of honor. A procession wrapped in black passed down paths polished by the footprints of guests who never felt the yard's weight. Wreaths arrived. Prayers were muttered with the precision of obligation. Conversations at the back of the room measured loss in the language of lineage and property, how the mistress's absence would affect social calendars, marriages, contracts. Benedita stood on the periphery, a body in a crowd of bodies that assumed it could read loyalty on faces. She wore the costume the house required of her, plain, clean, the visible mark of service. Her eyes were on a casket that had been closed quickly, as if to keep certain images from circulating. She watched people speak the rites that made absence lawful. She saw the handshakes that replaced questions. She felt nothing like triumph. The crowd's silence about motive was almost a relief. Public acknowledgement would have demanded a kind of exposure she avoided. The private calculus that had guided her for 3 years required that she remain a background figure in this visible drama. Neighbors nodded to neighbors. A few older enslaved women observed from the back with faces shaped into masks of knowing sorrow. Some watched Benedita more than the ceremony. Others met her glance and looked away. The plantation's social web rearranged itself to incorporate the absence of one woman in the center of its domestic performance, a gap neither questioned nor opened. After the funeral, the house performed the bureaucracies of grief, inventories made, letters written, silver polished and put away in drawers. Coronel Antonio, when he returned from whatever business had taken him, took charge of formalities with the calm a man raised in a system like his knows how to perform. He gave orders that concerned the management of property and the maintenance of appearances. There was a quiet administrative efficiency that followed death among the elite. It ensured continuity and refused the kind of disruptive scrutiny that might lead to uncomfortable details. For weeks after, the household lived with a soft paranoia that did not name itself. Servants who once moved with complete, unquestioned trust began to taste broths and lick spoons before setting them out. A sugar box, once propped open as an ordinary convenience, was kept closed with a small padlock for a day, then left open the next, as if the house could not bear to transform convenience into ritual suspicion. Guests commented on the mistress's absence and the house's resilience. Life in the field spun on. The coffee hands went about their assigned rows. The overseers counted the measures. The market received its shipments. Inertia had the force of a law. Around the lanes and in the taverns where plantation gossip found its way, people told variations of the same tentative story. Some said she had died of an infection. Some whispered about strange illnesses that summer. A few said, in a tone that quickly passed into the air like smoke, that misfortune had finally touched a cruel hand. These murmurs rarely reached the places where the law might be stirred. Rumor preserved its safety in vagueness. It served those who liked to be able to pity from a distance without examining their own complicity. Within the enslaved community, the mistress's death registered differently. It was not celebrated openly. Public celebrations of a master's death risked swift retribution, and the immediate years were still such that fear governed what was safe to say. But in private rooms and under the shade of mango trees, conversations exercised a different register. Some voices, softened, voiced relief that cruelty had been interrupted. Others warned against assuming ethics from an absence. The story would be decided in small acts of memory, who would carry it forward, how it would be told, which details would be preserved, and which would be allowed to drift into indefinido. Benedita, in the months that followed, continued to move through the house in the pattern that kept her hidden. She did not confess publicly. She did not leave a paper trail. She remained in appearance a competent servant whose presence had become the normal shape of domestic life. Her anonymity was part of her survival strategy. It was also a burden. To carry the knowledge of what she had done without a place to lay it down meant finding a private gravity, rituals of silence that the body held like scars. Years, as they do, accumulated. The political landscape of the country shifted slowly, with pressures that would eventually dismantle the legal framework of slavery. Those larger currents are beyond the immediate house, yet they would intersect with Benedita's life in ways oral memory recalls as decisive. For now, however, she remained a woman whose most consequential actions were contained within the narrow circumference of a single large house and the smaller circumference of her daughter's life. Maria lived on. The scars on her back, those palimpsests of violence, stayed with her as both shame and testimony. Oral histories insist that she learned to carry herself differently, to make herself less visible in public, to move in ways that avoided the gaze of those who might mistake beauty for invitation. Over time, she took on roles that gave her some measure of control over the shape of her days. She learned trades, she performed kinship as necessity demanded. Accounts say she married and had a life that stretched beyond the courtyard that had once been the scene of her most violent humiliation. But the details, names, dates, the contours of her family, are sometimes indefinido in the retellings. What remains consistent in those narratives is not the specific chronology, but the fact that Maria survived, and that her survival carried the memory of what had been done to her. Coronel Antonio's management of the estate after Donna Isabel's death followed the logic of continuity. The property remained operational. Overseers maintained productivity. There is no oral memory of a public reckoning with the causes of his wife's death. If there was private suspicion, it did not translate for the record into an inquiry that threatened the household order. The small domestic precautions, locked sugar boxes, servants tasting food, persisted for a time, and then eased as the house substituted new routines for old ones. Those practices registered as a kind of collective nervousness that lost its salience as the scandalous potential of the mistress's decline settled into the category of private misfortune. Benedita's life after the events of those years is told in fragments. She continued to work, sometimes in the same house, sometimes elsewhere. Oral memory varies on the details. What the stories agree on is that she lived long enough to see the world around her change. Abolition, when it arrived in 1888, shifted legal status but did not erase social hierarchies overnight. Communities recalibrated, families rearranged themselves. Former enslaved people found paths to different kinds of labor, formed new households, and carried with them the memories that would become both burden and witness. It is in this later period, according to those who preserved the story, that Benedita spoke. She did not make a public confession in a courtroom or in a pamphlet. Her words surfaced at the edge of intimate gatherings, in the presence of kin, and of those who would carry stories outward. Near the end of her life, years, perhaps decades after the mistress's death, she is said to have acknowledged what she had done. The confession, as family memory preserves it, was not a speech of bravado. It was quieter, a recounting that situated her action within the long catalogue of injuries she and her daughter had endured. She named the whipping, she named the absence of law, she described, in loose terms, the patient work she had carried out, but the specifics that might teach or harm were left out, as if the mouth that had confessed also understood. It had no right to provide a manual for harm. When these words were repeated in later retellings, they carried a complicated tone, an admixture of explanation, of remorse, of weary justification, and of a claim to a measure of agency in a life that had been largely shaped by others' decisions. Those who heard Benedita's confession recounted it differently, depending on what they wanted to preserve. Some emphasized her love for Maria as the motive. Others highlighted the impossibility of formal redress in her time. Whatever the slant, the confession functioned as a closure of a certain kind. It placed the moral calculus into the mouth of the woman who had acted, and thereby transferred the burden of interpretation to future listeners. Decades later, the story of what happened in that kitchen would circulate as part of a public memory with competing pressures. The Casa Grande itself, like many such houses, became an object of interest to those who curated the past. Walls that had once enclosed the lives of both masters and enslaved were refurbished and displayed. To some curators and visitors, the house represented architectural beauty, a sign of a region's prosperity, the backdrop for a heritage that could be photographed and admired. To others, it was a place that required the insertion of harder histories, the visible labor that maintained opulence, the lives marked by violence behind closed doors, the names of those who had been made invisible in official narratives. How the house was presented changed over time and varied by who wrote its story. Some exhibitions emphasized elegance and taste. Others attempted to include the narratives of enslaved people, though often in marginal ways. Whether Benedita's name appeared in plaques, whether Maria's scars were spoken of in tours, whether the confession carried by oral memory was placed in a case of documents, these things are not uniformly recorded. In many retellings, the presence of the enslaved in the museum narrative was partial at best. The material remains, tables, teapots, silver trays, were easier sometimes for institutions to display than the complicating moral histories that attached to them. The erasure or marginalization of painful stories in the interest of palatable pasts is a common arc in the museumization of sites tied to slavery. In the case of Fazenda das Flores, the degree of erasure is reported differently across accounts and is, in several respects, indefinido. Memory, however, has a stubborn way of escaping neat displays. The story of Benedita and Maria survived in the mouths of descendants, in the careful retellings of community elders, and in the small acts of remembrance that resistant cultures perform, songs, recipes, private remembrances. Those who carried the story, did not do so to glamorize violence, but to account for it. To hold a particular life up to scrutiny as a warning, as a lesson in moral complexity, as witness. The narrative lived in places that museums could not always control. In kitchens, where the tea ritual was recalled with a shudder, in the names passed through families, in the hush of a collective memory that refuses to let the past be smoothed into mere heritage. There is a moral elasticity here that resists neat resolution. For some descendants, Benedita's act became an emblem of a kind of retributive justice, a desperate measure taken where legal avenues were closed. For others, it was a wound that complicated the lines between victim and perpetrator, a reminder that violence begets violence and that the moral calculus of revenge is often populated with ghosts. These tensions are part of the story's afterlife. They are the conversations that make memory live and shift across generations. We are left, finally, with certain paradoxes that the story refuses to tidy. Benedita was both shaped by a system that rendered her a thing and, in that shape, became an agent who acted back, quietly, methodically, morally ambivalent. Her patience became weaponized. Her invisibility was, in the end, the means by which she acted. The master's tools, expertise, expectation, institutional trust, were turned against him, though in a manner that left many ethical questions unresolved. The household's assumptions about the loyalty of servants protected the powerful not only from being suddenly overthrown, but from being interrogated about the pains they imposed. To use those assumptions as cover for revenge was to play the master's game by his rules, and thereby to reveal how hollow those rules were when applied to lives of unequal value. If we ask what justice looked like in that world, the answer must be partial and uncomfortable. Legal justice was largely a fiction for the enslaved. Social justice, in the sense of a predictable, public equivalence of penalty and redress, was unavailable. What remains, what Benedita left as her testament, was memory, preserved in the small communities that outlived the plantation. That memory is a kind of soft justice. It refuses erasure, it insists on complexity, and it asks later generations to reckon not merely with the act, but with the conditions that made the act conceivable. There is also a technical point worth noting about how violence can be disguised by the forms people trust. Medical language, religious consolation, bureaucratic paperwork, they can all, by their authority, suspend inquiry. The house's reliance on expertise and the state's instruments of certification served, unintentionally or not, as a shield. The lesson is not new, but it is unnerving in its recurrence. Formal systems often have blind spots precisely where human cruelty is most intimate. In the quiet that remains after all these events, after the mistress has been buried and the house resumes its calendar, after Coronel Antonio continues to manage his property, after Maria grows into a life shaped by survival, after Benedita speaks her confession to those closest to her, the story persists as testimony. It does not ask to be consumed as sensation. It asks to be remembered as a moral knot. To hold it is to sit with the discomfort of a world in which the law protected property over personhood, and where the forms of domestic life could be recoded into instruments of slow harm. There is one more human detail that keeps the narrative from becoming only abstraction. Those who tell the story late into the night, grandchildren and great-grandchildren of people who were there, describe Benedita in small domestic terms. The way she folded napkins, the small laugh that once slipped out in the kitchen, the way her hands smelled of coffee at dawn. These unadorned recollections complicate the image of a woman reduced to a single notorious act. She is, in memory, the sum of a life, of tenderness and calculation, of maternal devotion, and a capacity for cold strategy. This complexity is the moral center, uneasy and necessary. The question the narrative leaves with us is not the easy one of condemnation or absolution. It is rather a set of soft and sharp prompts. What do we do with histories that make us uncomfortable? How do we balance the human impulse to seek justice with the reality that legal systems once denied it to whole classes of people? How does memory preserve what law would rather forget? And how does the act of telling itself become a small form of justice, one where names are kept and stories refuse to be flattened? These are not rhetorical tricks. They are the ethical labor the past demands of a present that still lives with its consequences. To remember Benedita in all her contradictions is to refuse the simplification that shelters the unjust. It is to let the past remain a living thing that provokes thought, rather than a polished relic that reassures. If this account has unsettled you in any way, that is part of its purpose, not to instruct wrongdoing, not to praise violence, but to make visible the moral complications that emerge when formal justice is denied and private revenge is all that remains. The life we have followed, its ritual, its patient cruelty, its slow unraveling, asks us to hold, at once, sorrow for what was endured and unease about the means chosen in response. If you want more recovered histories like this, consider subscribing. Memory goes on. In the small places where the story persisted, people told it not to glamorize but to witness. They told it to remind their children that the domestic rhythms of a house often mask a brutal ledger of pain. They told it to insist that names, no matter how humble, be carried forward. Benedita's name survived because there were ears willing to keep it. Maria's scars were retold so someone might know what had been done and who bore it. The Casa Grande, whether framed as a museum or preserved in photographs, could show fine wood and shining silver. But those objects would be only props if the stories of those who polished and served them were not also preserved in speaking. The moral knot tightens when we realize that many of these stories remain fragmentary. Oral histories compress, lose detail, soften edges. Official records smooth contradiction into phrases like natural causes. Between these two modes, memory and paper, lies a territory where truth is sometimes a collage rather than a single crisp image. To navigate it, we must accept uncertainty. We will sometimes say indefinido because some facts cannot be recovered with precision. That is an honest posture toward the past. I do not offer tidy conclusions. The question, was this justice, does not have a single answer that can satisfy every listener. Some will say Benedita enacted a measured form of reprisal against a system that had given her few options. Others will see only the moral abyss that violence opens. Both responses are part of the story's living afterlife. The proper response, perhaps, is to hold both views at once, and to let the tension make us more attentive, not more certain. When stories like this are placed in museums or in classrooms, there is a risk that they will be flattened into exemplar. Lessons about cruelty or revenge that strip the human texture from the lives involved. There is an alternative. To keep such stories messy, to teach them as case studies in moral complexity, to place names back into the archive where they belong. Doing so honors the memory of those like Benedita and Maria and prevents the house from being only a picturesque shell. The last image I leave you with is not of violence, but of a small, ordinary object, a silver tray, its surface catching a late afternoon sun. The tray is not a tool in itself. It becomes meaning only because of the hands that carry it and the rules of the house that give those hands shape. To remember Benedita is to look at that tray and see not only polished metal, but also the invisible ledger beneath domestic service, the debts of pain, the measures of survival, the quiet, difficult arithmetic of a life lived under constraint. Type one word in the comments. T. If this story reads to you like an act of private retribution born of denied justice, or slow, if the length and patience of the plan make you question whether the act could ever be justified. Whatever you choose, hold the discomfort. Remember the names. Let the history stay complicated, as the past itself was.